We are experiencing technical difficulties. Please stand by. 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 We are experiencing technical difficulties. Please stand by.
Cool. And I can take up this backpack. I can use this and then at some point you're like, all right, try it all.
Hi again, everybody. Sorry about that. We were having a little issue with sound, but hopefully now you can all hear us. Welcome to the first webinar for the month of February, which appropriately is focused on winter cycling, which Stephen and I are pretty excited. Here in the Netherlands, we're going to see a little bit of snow for the second time this winter, which will be exciting.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, so tonight we want to focus on what it is that cities and planners and designers and policymakers can do to really encourage people to keep cycling all year round. So that's going to be our focus, looking at what people can do and then why it's so important to be taking these steps to make winter cycling accessible to everyone. So before we get started, for those who haven't been to a webinar with Stephen or I before, we thought we'd introduce you to ourselves and a bit of our own winter cycling experience.
Yeah. So I'm Stephen. I've hosted, I think, a few webinars before this, so you may have already met me. If not, I am one of two Canadians at Mobycon, Melissa being the other one. I grew up in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada, and as a lot of Canadians will know, and perhaps even people outside of Canada, it is very much a winter city, known for its harsh winds and summer mosquitoes, but in the winter, harsh climate. And really in the last, winter cycling is relatively new to the city there. Even growing up, it wasn't a big thing. And only within the last 10, 15 years, it's kind of become somewhat of a movement, you could say, or you'll see people out on the streets. And I mean, personally, I unfortunately never cycled in the winter. I remember trying, especially when I got into university and it became a bit more hip almost. For the trouble for me was I just couldn't even get out of my own driveway.
Right.
Because the snow was too deep, I couldn't actually cycle. I'd have to walk perhaps 500 meters to a kilometer to get to somewhere that was cleared, and then I could actually cycle. But along with the infrastructure, cycling infrastructure, it's very much increasing. And with that, you get more users. So I'm very much looking forward to having this discussion tonight and also just kind of bounce off each other, what our experiences are.
Yeah.
So that's a bit my background. Melissa, you can give yourself an introduction.
For sure. So I'm the International Communications Specialist here at the Mobycon Delft office. So we do have an office in Canada, so there are other Canadians with us. We should say that.
Good thing you said that. Yeah, absolutely.
But we're the resident Canadians here in the Netherlands for Mobycon. But my winter cycling experience, I think, is quite similar in that I grew up in Ontario, born in Ottawa, lived in Kitchener-Waterloo area for a really long time, but never really cycled in the winter because it wasn't something that my family did when I was growing up. And then when I was in university, I lived in Toronto, and it wasn't necessarily the most cycle-friendly place at the time. But then in 2007, we moved to Vancouver on the West Coast. And although the winters are a little bit different, this photo is actually from Vancouver, so it's one of those freak moments when we had a lot of snow. But a lot of the experience for me in the winter was much more about cycling in the rain, about darker evenings. And because Vancouver was investing in infrastructure, it became more of an all year round kind of activity. And so, for my family, this was the normal. We're actually coming back from the kids' swimming lessons. And please don't tell my daughter I shared this photo. She's not watching anyway.
She's not going to see it. It'll be fine.
Yeah. But that's sort of, my experience. And I think that'll be important as we're going through this, is to remember that there really is so many different ways to experience winter, whether you're in the northern or southern hemisphere.
Absolutely. If we go to this next picture here, if we can get it on the screen. Yeah, exactly. So winter's different everywhere. Obviously, winter where we're from is very different than winter here in the Netherlands or in some places in the States, Russia, France. It's all totally different. It's, some places get snow, sometimes it's wet, dry, humid.
I've got so many friends that share stories of them cycling in the winter, like bundled up with goggles and balaclavas. And then the flip side is as much rain gear as possible.
Exactly. Yeah. Here that's a classic thing. I just cycled yesterday, got home and I was soaking wet. So for some it's a matter of staying warm, and others it's a matter of staying dry, or both. So I think that's a good representation in these images. And if we go to the next slide, we've got a really nice table, actually. I think this was made by the Canadian Institute of Planners. And you can almost sort of block out and categorize winter climates. And it's also, I think, a really good tool for policymakers and advisors and governments to show that maybe our city's winter climate is comparable to that of X other city that might have better or different infrastructure that you could learn from. Yeah,
and I think that's a really great graph, and it helps to reinforce that idea that we all experience winter differently, but the important thing is to make sure that we can keep people moving and give them a lot of options for transport.
Exactly.
Because the common adage, at least in Vancouver, was people like, oh, I'm putting my bike away for the winter, and what we want to do really is to allow people to do that all year round.
Yeah.
So I guess, one of we've got a few different approaches that we're going to talk about today. And the first one seems obvious. It's winter. It's about clearing away the snow.
Yeah. You could say that it's really obvious, but there's actually a number of things that are, they're far more subtle, actually. So perhaps the first thing is about, you've got different tools to do the job. I think when the snow is deep and heavy, the most common is the plow. But the nice part with a plow is you have different widths and you have different sizes of the machine itself. So on the top left, you've got that sort of mini-like plow, which I think is actually kind of cute.
I remember them going along the sidewalks growing up in Ontario.
Exactly. You've got brushes as well. And you've got snow blowers, and of course on the bottom you see you've got sort of a pickup truck attachment plow, so it can also be I mean, in theory, you could switch it up with a brush as well. And then snow blowers. And each of these have their own pluses and or pros and cons. The plow being that it's perhaps the fastest. You can clear stuff usually at about an operating speed of 40 kilometers an hour. But of course, then if it's an uneven surface, you do risk damaging things. But I mean, if you want it properly cleared, that's perhaps a risk you have to take.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why, and maybe you'll mention this, one of the reasons why they use the brush here more often in the Netherlands.
Exactly. So here, especially with these small bricks, if one is just a little bit out of way, you could basically blast the brick right out of the ground if you've got a plow. And fortunately, the Netherlands doesn't get enough snow for them to really need a plow all that often. Because a power brush, it works far slower, so the general operating speed is like 10 kilometers an hour. But once the snow's thicker than 2 centimeters, that operating speed goes way down. So it's just not a very efficient way after 2 centimeters of snow to clear it. And then you have the snowblower, of course, which I think a lot of people in heavy winter climates will know, but it's even slower. Yeah. Even slower, and they're very expensive to operate because to turn that turbine takes a lot of energy or fuel. So it's usually a sort of last minute use. You wouldn't use it unless there's 70 centimeters of snow all of a sudden, which a plow isn't going to do much.
Actually, I mentioned to you when we were preparing for this, Stephen, about this video I saw, I think it was from Montreal, a sidewalk snow plow going along with a massive flatbed truck collecting all the snow from the plow as they move along, which, although from the fuel efficiency standpoint isn't the best.
Not quite.
But in terms of making sure that snow moves along and doesn't stay in place.
Then it's not, you don't have to store it anywhere. It's already out of the way.
Exactly.
And I think the next one, so the next one would be prioritizing. We've talked a lot about Mobycon about cycle routes, walking routes, even car driving routes. But a snow clearing route is also quite a thing. And I think people familiar with maybe city operations, this is nothing new to you. But at least in the Netherlands, they operate with an A, B, and C route. And A being the most crucial, that should be almost clear all the time. B being sort of the foundation of the plan. Under normal conditions, it should be clear. And C being once B is cleared, then you go to C. So that's often residential areas and maybe suburban areas in a more, let's say, less European definition.
Right. And I guess with the A routes, that would be, in my experience more recently, as we've had some colder weather here, those would be the routes that they would often salt first as well. So they know that it's likely that this would be a place that would freeze up. Let's make sure it's clear. Absolutely.
So they've also got, in addition to the prioritization, they also have sort of a layered action approach, which is on the next slide. And that's, you've got preventative action, you've got remedial, and repeat. So the preventative, and this, we could do a whole webinar on this actually, and it's quite technical, but in short, especially when it comes to salting, because plowing is, removing the snow is a bit different, but preventative is often salting, or laying down sand. You can take preventative action if you know that snow is going to come, or precipitation for that matter. You can take remedial action, which is once the snow is already there, or the ice is already there. And then repeat action, because maybe it's snowing for days, you don't know, like at one time is not going to be enough, obviously. And then those actions can also are usually supported by a number of tools, which is salt, brine, or sand, grit, ash. So sand, grit, and ash are always just for traction, because those don't melt anything.
No, of course.
Then a brine, which is, as you can think of, it's kind of like pickles. It's a liquid. It's a solution, so salt solution. And then just the solid salt
rock
particles.
Salt that we're probably most familiar with.
Exactly. And you've got a couple different ones. You have sodium chloride, you've got calcium chloride, magnesium chloride. Sodium chloride is the most common and is cheapest and easiest to access. But the calcium chloride and magnesium chloride are more soluble, so they're effectively more effective.
Okay.
And sometimes they even mix them too. So they'll mix calcium chloride with sodium chloride. But the thing with the brine is that below -18, which happens very often where we're from.
Yeah.
Brine doesn't really do much because it's already it's too much liquid and it'll just freeze.
It'll just freeze, yeah.
So those are your kind of tools, I suppose.
Okay. I have a question about the prioritization. Because I think a lot of people watching will think of this in terms of more of the road network.
Yeah.
How does that apply here, do you know, in terms of the bike network? Is it a similar sort of prioritization?
Well, the way they choose it, I would say, is similar to the road network in a way. It's really about volumes. So if it's a bike path or bike way, or they also have supercycle highways or whatever you want to call them, if that's a very high volume spot, it's likely that they're going to prioritize that, of course. And perhaps the more rural places going through a field is not quite as much prioritized because the volume is likely, it's possible that it's high depending on where it is.
It could be an intercity connection.
It could, yeah, exactly.
But, yeah.
But generally the volumes are lower and therefore the prioritization is lower.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I assume pedestrian network falls into that as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The way they approach pedestrian network is pretty much the same thing.
Yeah. Perfect. Cool. So I guess the other thing we, often come up against, it's something you mentioned when you were talking about your story, why you didn't cycle, is this idea of like, where does the snow go? And how do we accommodate for that? And I mean, it's not up to us to tell you where snow goes.
There's other powers in charge of that.
But I think what is important is understanding how these tools help to facilitate access for people. Yeah.
Yeah, well, as you can see in this picture, I mean, this, especially in my experience, this is really common. Yeah, as you can see, there's you can almost see there's a sidewalk, but it's almost blocked off in a way. And they've plowed this one street, not the other one, I guess the one that's running sideways.
Yeah, it looks like this one was plowed earlier and this one was plowed much
exactly,
more recently.
And then the stuff on the bigger road was just pushed onto the other one, and perhaps most notably onto the sidewalk. And this is also something that happens with bike lanes and bike paths as well. And so snow storage becomes a big issue. And I think something that perhaps a lot of people question is, well, how can I design to store snow and so forth? And it's not really a question of design. It's really a budgetary thing. Just like roads, I mean, we choose to remove snow from certain roads and not others. And the same thing with, or at least it should be the same thing with sidewalks and bicycle infrastructure. So you can theoretically you would design it as wide curbs as possible to keep snow there, but that's just really not a long-term solution.
Yeah.
Because you're always going to have winter, you might as well budget for it, and so that snow can be removed.
And yeah, that also ties into, I mean, not just when we're thinking, I mean, obviously when we're thinking about snow, but I'm even thinking about wetter places like the Pacific Northwest or here in the Netherlands. That prioritization and the budget towards clearance is also when we think about leaves that have fallen from the fall and then they start to clog up gutters and create puddles. Or similarly, going past a curb or a sidewalk in most parts of winter North America where the puddles are so thick that you actually have to walk on the snow all the way around or heavily divert it when you're on a bike. That budgetary prioritization helps to really allow people to keep cycling without having to worry about, where they can go.
Well, and a lot of, you could have a discussion about design, but I think the thing is it's not that relevant for winter because a lot of the design principles that are important for winter are also important for other times of year. I mean, you could say, well, it's slippery and people you want to prevent slips. Well, that's about turning radius, and that's also the case in the summer. You don't want a 90 degree turning angle in the summer either. So that's not necessarily winter specific. So I think that's where it really comes down to budget.
Right. And then of course where your network is planned and how you integrate that network. And I have this great shot from, actually my husband Chris took it years ago when we were in Vancouver and then had one of these really heavy snowfalls. And he actually recounted this story for me. He left the house. This is like 2 minutes from where we were living. He wanted to go out for a bike ride, needed some fresh air, got to the end of the cycle route, and this was what he faced. And that's an uphill incline in front of him.
Yeah, that you don't see in the picture. That just looks flat to me.
Yeah,
but
it's not, I can guarantee. So he just turned around and went home. And you can think about the number of people that would be affected by that when your network isn't connecting you where you need to go.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and especially when it's a bicycle path, you said, right? Like,
Yeah.
and then it just stops. Like,
Yeah.
okay, well, thanks. Where do I go now?
Yeah, so I mean, making sure your network is connected, making sure that people can continue that access, I think is one of the things that is really important, but often we don't think about in the winter because we automatically default often to a more motorized or car-focused thinking.
I mean, I think also the thing to consider is winter cities are going to be more expensive to operate. That's just, or at least for maintenance-wise, that's just a given. Because, yeah, if you don't have snow, there's no snow to clear, and you don't have to pay for that. So I think if we can accept that there's going to be costs involved, then we can just say, all right, well then let's budget for it, and let's treat cycleways and sidewalks and so forth with, or at least just give them just as much of attention as a highway or a big thoroughfare. I mean, I think of Portage Avenue in Winnipeg, which is the biggest, most common road, or most well-known road in Winnipeg. But it really comes down to budget.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Well, another consideration that I think is really important, I'm noticing we're starting to come out of it now that we're getting into February, but it's about the lighting and what that means in terms of how people experience their cities and their transportation in more darker months. And, when we consider, here in the Netherlands, we're not too far north, but you think about, Sweden, Finland, Norway, or various parts of North America that are much further north than the 49th parallel. It's dark well into the morning.
It's an issue, yeah.
And then and starting early in the evening. And so, when we're thinking about encouraging and enabling winter cycling, lighting plays such a big role in that.
Well, absolutely, absolutely. And I think another thing to mention is that it's not necessarily just, often what you hear is, well, make sure you're wearing bright clothes, making sure you're wearing reflective this, I mean, that doesn't really help anyone. Yeah. I mean, on an individual level, of course, that helps that one person, but it's not going to get people to cycle or to go outside.
Right.
And if an area is already well lit, well, first of all, that clothing is probably not really necessary, that high-vis stuff. So you're already making it more accessible. And two, it's also far safer on a social level. Because we all know, I'm sure we've gone walking somewhere and there's a dark alley and we don't want to go down there. Well, if that's where you have to go, but it's really dark and kind of gloomy, yeah, that's also there might be a great sidewalk, but if it's dark and gloomy, you're not really feeling so glad about walking down there.
Of course. So I think, when we're talking about, how cities can plan better to enable cycling in the winter, it's about making sure a lot of these cycle routes are lit. So, for example, we think about the average street. Of course, the street is lit, but what about, the neighborhood bikeways? Yeah. Or your more cycle superhighways, like here in the Netherlands. Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, it could also be something small as like a connection between a park and another part of a neighborhood. You have often those sort of small little walking routes between parks and a residential area. Well, yeah, that's a very good place that would be quite common to maybe feel uncomfortable, especially at night.
Yeah.
Or when it's dark. It doesn't have to necessarily be night if you're far north enough.
Yeah. And I think, we'll get into this a little bit later when we're talking about why these things are important, but, thinking of places where it is dark for much longer throughout the day, where, much further north when it's just dark all the time. When we think about travel, we often think about people like you and I and how we feel uncomfortable in these spaces, but that increased social safety also benefits, kids and things.
Yeah,
and people
kids,
that feel
elderly, people of other socioeconomic status. I mean, it's not just the, let's say, the sort of norm cyclists that you tend to see in media and magazines. It's also people that would probably like to cycle and could very much benefit from cycling, but are not doing so for exactly that reason.
Yeah.
And I think we even have a good example of a project we did in Zoetermeer. Nachtnet is what we call it in Dutch, but basically means night network or net.
Night network.
Night network. Net short for network. And fiets being bicycle. But they basically made a network specifically designed so that people feel comfortable in these specific spots traveling at night, because that was a recurring issue that people weren't feeling so safe. And they've really focused on lighting, and you can see on the right there, I really like the top right image actually, where it's sort of almost like a disco light thing underneath the bridge. Like you can also be really creative with light. It doesn't have to be just a boring old lamppost.
Yeah, I mean, from what I understand from this specific project is that it's not every route is lit, but they identified core areas where people wanted to travel that they were uncomfortable traveling in, and focused on making them much safer and much more comfortable.
Yeah, in a way, using a bit of the same logic as the snow clearing thing, they just prioritized certain networks that people were, where the demand was there and people were already using it, and said, well, okay, this should really be safe for at night, because it's not well lit enough.
And you mentioned a thing about making it fun, and there's actually, if you have time, look it up. There's an example, the Rijn-Waalpad in the east, between Arnhem and Nijmegen. They actually they've gamified one of the tunnels, so you can, as you travel through it, if you get the app, it starts to remember you, and you can start to program the lights as you go through the tunnel.
Oh, that's funky.
Really cool.
Okay, cool.
It's well worth checking out. I mean, you can do that all year round, but it's especially nice in the more winter months.
In the darker times.
Yeah. And then finally, I think when we talked about the network and making sure people still have access. One of the things that I think a lot of cities are starting to really come to accept and to build for is this idea of connecting the dots. And what I have here, the bottom right picture doesn't match the other two because the other two are from Vancouver, but it didn't fit on the screen. But it's this idea that when we're thinking about enabling transport from the city level, it's about making sure we're giving people choice. So this would be a typical commute for me when I was living in Vancouver, where I would mix walking with public transport and cycling from the bike share.
Yeah.
When I didn't feel like cycling the full distance because it was too cold or too wet, by providing those options. Yeah,
providing options is a really important thing. Obviously not just for winter, but I think especially for winter, when the weather is perhaps a bit less predictable or agreeable. And I think the OV chip card is a good example. In fact, I was just talking to a colleague, a more newer colleague the other day, and I was explaining to him about how the OV chip card works, and he said, this works for train, tram, bus. He was counting, and I'm like, yes. Oh, this is great.
Yeah.
It's so easy. And that's exactly it, is that you don't have to really worry. You just have that card, and especially in the winter months when something can go wrong quite easily. It's raining, you get a flat tire. Having that option available really makes it far easier and also more accessible, because you're willing to take that quote-unquote risk to go out, because you're not afraid that if something goes wrong, then you're stranded somewhere.
Yeah.
And I think the principles of sustainable safety really count here. This is when we talk about the principles of homogeneity, functionality, predictability, forgiveness, and the state of awareness. And this is all about how the network connects to the different options you have. So I think the options is a big thing. I remember even having a nightmare actually once. I'm not joking. I had a nightmare of cycling to university when I was in university in Winnipeg, and then getting stranded somewhere, and my dad having to pick up my bike and put it in the car, and it was just this. I mean, it's not really a nightmare. It wasn't that scary, but it was just inconvenient.
Yeah, I mean, for the average university student, that would be a nightmare.
Yeah.
Suddenly, you're stuck somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. For the urban-minded university student I was, that was a bad dream.
Yeah. So I think when we're thinking about, we've mentioned 3 different ways of enabling or encouraging from the city level in terms of obviously snow clearance, or even just making sure paths are kept clear, and prioritization, both in terms of treatment of routes, but also budgetary prioritization. We've talked about lighting, which is really important, regardless of northern, southern hemisphere, or any time of the year, as we pointed out. But especially in winter months, in terms of encouraging people to keep cycling because they feel safer. And then, of course, providing choice, because not every trip can be done by bike. But if we're connecting those with walking and with transport, we're giving people more options.
More options, and it's adaptable. If, like you said, I'm sure if you were in Vancouver and you all of a sudden said, crap, it's raining cats and dogs and you just wanted to hop on a bus, you could.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's really about offering that option, because otherwise you go, well, maybe I'll just take the car then.
Yeah.
I mean,
which is not the option that we want to give people.
no, exactly. And you're even in a luxury position if you have a car, for that matter.
Yeah. So yeah, we've talked a lot about sort of the how, but what I wanted to do also is to focus on the why. So why should we bother investing this? Things are working out pretty well in most cities from what we can think we see.
Yeah.
In terms of people maintaining transport options and access in the winter. But I think what we tend to forget is oftentimes when we're looking at transport much we at it from a much more commute focus. So that 9 to 5. And, you know, especially when we're thinking about like nowadays, people are stuck at home because we have to work from home. They want to get outside. They want to be active. It's really important to be able to enable that, I think, at the city level in terms of our mental and physical health. Totally.
Yeah, I mean, there's a plethora of reasons other than just infrastructure to do this. And I mean, like we said at the beginning, it's pretty normal outside of the Netherlands to just put your bike away at the end of, like I said, the fall, depending wherever fall is for you in the world. And to just say, okay, I'm putting it away and we'll bring it back out in the spring again. And I mean, frankly, who can blame anyone for doing that if you don't have the infrastructure and the systems there to do that? But the other side of that is when those are established, you can fight a lot of societal issues with cycling and active transport in general. And one thing that I think a lot of people, especially now when you're stuck inside, is seasonal effectiveness disorder.
Yeah.
You know, when you've just got less sun, you're probably inside a lot, not getting a lot of movement, which certainly doesn't help. I'm just as much a victim of this as anyone else. And that active travel, whether you're commuting to your work or just going for a ride, can be a good way to combat that. Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, there's the groups that benefit from it. And one of the ones that I talk about a lot because I'm a parent is how kids benefit. So, you know, if we focus so much on the commute to work, we forget that there is this massive part of the population that can't drive yet. And
Absolutely.
So cycling becomes not only a way to get from A to B, but also a source of independence for them. So when we prioritize and enable this ability to cycle all year round, this is, again, my daughter. She won't be watching. This is a much better photo. But this is shortly after we moved to the Netherlands, and she's among dozens of other students cycling to school. This is in February, so it's still winter months, and this is just how people travel because it's been made easy for them.
Yeah, and safe.
Exactly. And so if we think about prioritizing for kids in terms of winter cycling, we open up not just that independence, but also the ability to get to and from school.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't know if it's still the case or where it came out, but I've heard, you know, that Dutch kids or Dutch children are apparently some of the happiest in the world.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's that much of it's not a coincidence that they have this independence at a young age to go to whatever swimming lessons or whatever thing to school on their own.
Yeah.
There's got to be some sort of correlation. I don't have any proof of that, but you know, if I was that age, I would think, yeah, that would certainly make me happier as well. But it's not just kids, right? You've got also the elderly who are usually not working, and even if they are, they still need to get around. And the ability for seniors to cycle, I mean, they're a group that is probably more prone to injury, probably need a bit more time, a little bit more space to get where they're going. They're not going to be going down there with a race bike going 25 kilometers an hour.
Exactly.
And this is also where the maintenance part comes in, because you got to make sure that that ice that for you and I might just be easy and we can avoid it, that ice could really do some damage to these populations.
Yeah, I mean,
this group.
It's noted here in the Netherlands, at least, that the elderly are some of the highest, that is the highest group of people that experience falls on bikes. And so there's some that is related to, you know, keeping balance and things like that. But, we should remove all the other barriers that are potentially there, including, if there's potential ice, or if we're making it too hard to maneuver through the snow. And, also from a mental health perspective, like a lot of elderly will feel quite shut in and trapped in the winter, and they benefit a lot from getting out and cycling. And so I think I've come to take it for granted living here. That it's just a normal part of my day that I'll see someone who looks like my grandparents cycling
going
past
by.
me. But we should be planning and enabling that in all of our cities.
Absolutely. I mean, the other aspect would be, so you've got the elderly, you've got children, but you also have people with disabilities. And I think that's something that I noticed, not only just moving about, you see people on mobility scooters, but even personally, a few years ago, my dad came to visit, and at that point I was in Amsterdam, and he walks with a cane, and I mean, he's not in a mobility scooter or anything, but I'd really noticed when you've got all these bikes parked and stuff, for me, you just walk around, but when, you're not quite the same ability, it can be really tough and annoying. It was not just annoying for him, but it's like, oh yeah, crap, we got to walk around this here. And it really made me realize how when you design for these sort of spaces, you can open up a whole world of accessibility for these groups.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, although our context is very much Dutch specific in terms of bikes being strewn on the sidewalks and stuff like that, you just translate that into if a sidewalk is improperly cleared or
Absolutely.
a bike lane, because bike lanes, even in North America, even though they're a little narrower, are often much more convenient for people in wheelchairs and mobility scooters. Or if the sidewalk isn't quite plowed, it becomes a safer space for someone with some sort of mobility assistance. So absolutely prioritizing these kinds of things and creating this kind of space is really important for the disabled, and also remembering that just because somebody's on a bike doesn't mean they're able. I have countless friends with arthritis, and the bike is how they get around. And if you make that no longer an option, you've taken away the mobility of that individual. Yeah,
absolutely. And the boom of the e-bike is a big factor as well. People that would probably just a regular old mechanical bike would say, no, that's too much effort on the joints, or it might be too strenuous. Yeah, this is a group that, boom, they've got a whole bunch of infrastructure ready to go for them, here at least. And if you enable that, these groups might say, maybe I will invest in an e-bike. Maybe I will do this. Maybe it's just more, now I just have more capacity to invest in this for myself.
Yeah. And I would be remiss if I didn't also talk about the experience for women.
Of course.
So one of the things about, in previous sessions we talked about network design, and that has a big impact on enabling multi-purpose care trip training that most women tend to do. But if we're not thinking about it as an all year round activity, basically we're telling women, in this case, that from, let's say, November to beginning to middle of March, you now have to drive. You don't have a choice. The car is your default.
It's just crossing out one more option for them.
Yeah. And so when you're thinking about, okay, I've got to get my child to school, and then I have to go to the grocery store, go take care of an elderly family member, or do any other number of trips along with getting to and from work, it becomes a lot more difficult when we've taken that option away.
And and I mean, you can also think of the opposite, the other direction, is giving them that is a huge bonus.
Of course.
It's one thing I think there's hopefully very few places where they're taking it away. Hopefully they're offering it to them.
Yeah.
And then I guess moving on to another group is those that, I just briefly touched on it earlier, was those that just of low socioeconomic status, those that, don't have access to a car, especially in places where it's really designed for cars.
Yeah.
And ideally, we don't want to live in a society where it's a sort of a social requirement to drive.
Yeah.
Because A, it's expensive, and B, it's also not good for anyone, really.
Well, and I think another thing that often that connection isn't made. We talked about, not always focusing on the commute, but oftentimes people, it covers all of these groups with the exception of very young children. They don't work the normal traditional 9 to 5 hours.
Yeah.
And oftentimes in a lot of places where there's budget cuts for public transport, that option doesn't exist for them either. So if they can't afford a car and their transport's not serving them, the bike becomes the easy option for these people to be able to maintain access.
Yeah, it's a very cheap mode of transport. I mean, whether you're rich or poor, if you want to use those words, I mean, it doesn't really matter. It's a very cost-efficient way of getting around.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So yeah, I guess we've kind of covered. I realize this was sort of, we could go much more in depth than all of this information.
If we gave ourselves a couple hours, we'd fill them.
Yeah, of course. But I think what's, the takeaway really is that what we should be doing at a city level is really making sure that we're giving people choice, that we're really enabling all-around cycling. Cycling isn't a fair weather activity.
No.
And it just means making things a little bit easier and more comfortable for everyone, not just the groups that we just talked about, but the average middle-aged man, of course, as well.
Yes, just as much as anyone else.
Yeah.
Just as much as anyone else.
So, winter cycling, while it is obviously an important topic, and we should put some emphasis on how to manage it, how to, budget for it, prioritize for it, it shouldn't necessarily be seen as an exception. We should make it more of a common thing in a lot of cities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, in addition to those, all these great things we've mentioned, there's also quite a few knock-on effects. Mm-hmm. So you've got, if you're designing for cyclists in the winter, not only are cyclists going to have better sight lines, but drivers are probably also going to be safer. The other one, and I actually just read quite a good book about this. It's pretty big in the Netherlands. I don't think it's Het Recht van het Snelste. It's from Marco de Pommelstoet. Not at all a non-Dutch book, but very good book either way. Is the cost of an accident on an individual and their loved ones and those around them is huge. The societal cost, and it's going to stay with them for the rest of their life. It's not something that it's like, oh, got in an accident on Wednesday and Friday I've forgotten about it.
Yeah.
The cost is really big. And that's next to all of the environmental benefits, reduced congestion, less greenhouse gas emissions. Well, these things, I think, are obvious for most people, but they are pluses. They should be mentioned.
Of course. So the moral of the story is winter cycling is good for everyone. We should make it possible in every city.
Exactly.
So I think we've got a few questions. I've heard from our backstage managers, we've got 2 or 3. So the first one is, could someone define what properly cleared means and if there's standards around that in different cities? That's a very nuanced question, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's actually a good one because I was looking through the Dutch COW manual, and they have one that's specifically on clearing. And of course, I hear in my head, it's like the Netherlands is not the same as it is other places. True. But what I've also heard is that properly cleared is basically not dangerous. That sounds rather vague, but for instance, in a lot of places, and I think I was at one point in Northwest Territories, in Yellowknife, where they don't clear the snow at all. They just let it pack down because they get enough of it. They let it pack down, and I think it's also the same in Oulu. Oulu, Finland is a very good example of winter cycling, where they just pack it down and then put sand on top of it. So it's still usable. You can drive on it, you can walk on it without slipping, you can cycle on it. So there it's technically there's no clearing involved. Right. It's just making it usable.
Making it safe.
Making it safe, exactly. So I think it's, if you remove all the safety risks, that would be properly cleared.
Okay. So then the answer to the second question is yes, it is different for the different conditions in different cities.
Absolutely.
So in the Netherlands, properly cleared would be cleared.
Yeah. I mean, it's rare that you get more than 2 centimeters. That would be a lot.
Yeah.
And clear for them is, well, there's no snow on the ground.
Right. And then I think of Vancouver, clear would be clear to the point that if there was a freeze overnight, because it does tend to fluctuate plus and minus, that then doesn't turn into ice afterwards. Yeah,
and there's quite a bit of information on what conditions are likely to result in dangerous conditions. Going through that manual, I was almost a bit too technical, but you've got some conditions where the surface level is below a temperature, but the air temperature is different, and therefore it's more likely to freeze. I mean, this could be a whole other webinar.
Right.
But
well, maybe what we can do, because I know we have other questions, is we can recommend people go and check out the CROW manual.
There you go. That's a good idea. I definitely can't read it all out right now.
Right. So the next question that we have, just coming up for us here, wouldn't you say that salt is best reserved for car infrastructure, but just plow, brush, sand, or grit for bike and ped? And I can understand where this question might be coming from because, when we're thinking like from pedestrian infrastructure, we both lived in cities that salt, it ruins all of your shoes.
Yep.
And I know that there's similarly, salt can be quite challenging and dangerous for bikes as well in terms of not just the tires themselves, but also for the chain and keeping the maintenance. Yeah,
I would say, could we get the question back up? Because I just want to give it a good answer rather than only answer. Great, thanks guys. I would say it's not best reserved for car infrastructure because there are going to be times like ice. If it's black ice, you're not going to be able to clear that with a brush. You're not going to be able to clear that with a plow. And putting grit down will temporarily add some some traction, but there's no melting agent involved at all.
Right.
Unless you're just lucky enough that it goes above zero the day after, but no one can count on that. So I think that's where where salt, can really be a useful tool. Ideally, you don't have to use salt at all and you can just clear it. But I think it's very good to have that in your tool sort of arsenal because there are going to be conditions where ice, it's particularly for ice and not for snow.
Okay.
It really doesn't do much to snow, actually.
Right. We have another question. I think it's the last one, but it's a two-parter. So first part of the question.
Ooh.
In Denver, there is a good plowing on protected bike lanes, but the challenge is that even when the lane is plowed, given the sunny climate, some of the snow will melt during the day and refreeze. And so I think this relates to your preventative and then remedial and repeat.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, if you know that it's going to probably, let's say it's going above zero and then it's going to go back down below zero overnight, you know that it's going to freeze. And you know that, well, part of that snow is going to melt and likely, given the drainage, is going to dribble down onto the lane or sidewalk or whatever piece of infrastructure.
Right.
And that is a matter of drainage. Preventative action.
Right.
And I think that's also where the ice or the salt comes in handy because, you can't really you could plow, but that's for one it's costly. You have to do that everywhere. And brushing does absolutely nothing to ice.
Right.
So I think that's where so this actually also answers the question we had before that as well. This would be a perfect instance for preventative salting.
Right, when you know that you have that freeze, thaw, freeze.
Yeah.
Doing the preventative salt before the freeze actually incurs.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then what's the second part of the question? I'm curious. It's coming up.
Oh,
we can't read it.
We can't read it. We see it's from Drew.
Any ideas for addressing that? Well, I think we gave
that.
that.
I think we did it.
Yeah. Perfect. I think two parts was that it was just a little long for our box that we read, but that's great. I'm sure there are a lot more questions out there that maybe people didn't have a chance to ask. So they're welcome to email either of us.
Yeah.
And do check out the CROW manual if you're looking for a lot more of that technical information.
There's plenty of it. Let me guarantee you that.
It is available in English. I can say that. But otherwise, in the meantime, I think that we've covered a fair amount of ground today.
I think we have.
But if you're still interested, it would be prudent of me to mention that next week we're actually hosting in this studio the Winter Cycling Congress. So that's 2 days of winter cycling information, all digitally available right here from our studio with myself and Angela Vanderkloof. The website is up on the screen now if you'd like to register to join us, and that'll be on the 11th and 12th of February. And then we also have a very special interview coming up the following week on the 17th of February with Isla Tanaka from the city of Edmonton. Our colleague Wayne in Canada interviewed her. So it's a pre-recorded interview about the winter city strategy there and what the city is doing to really encourage citizens of Edmonton to celebrate winter rather than hibernate throughout the month.
That's a big factor. Attitude is a factor. I mean, the infrastructure's got to be there, but you also have the attitude.
Yeah. And I mean, what I know of people of Edmonton, they do love their winters still. So.
They do. Yeah, they've got a great winter policy.
Yeah. I mean, I love winter too.
One more thing to note, I will be speaking, I'm supposed to be looking there, I will be speaking actually at the Winter Cycling Congress.
That's right.
Yeah, on the 11th, I believe that's 6 o'clock Central European time. I think it's 6 o'clock. Either way, you can check online, the program's there. I'll be doing a Pecha Kucha forum about trying to implement some of the Dutch solutions in a winter context. But what I'm really looking forward to is that it's a whole bunch of winter cycling advocates and people that are involved in winter cycling coming together, and we can all just exchange ideas. But want to shout that out there.
Oh, of course. Thank you for reminding me, Stephen. So I think we've come to the end. Thank you everybody for coming out tonight or today, whatever time it is for you, and enjoying some winter cycling talk with us. Yes. Thank you to, as always, our crew behind the scenes who have been giving me little notes throughout the session, which has been great. And thank you, Stephen. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Melissa. It was a pleasure.
All right, till next time.
Bye-bye.